They said she was finished. They whispered that without Richard's money, Sarah wouldn't last a week in the city. When the gavel banged down, finalizing the most brutal divorce the Upper East Side had seen in a decade, Sarah walked out with nothing but her dignity and a beat-up Honda. Her ex-husband laughed, his lawyers smirked, and his new, younger fiancé waved goodbye. But they forgot one thing. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. No one knew the truth about who really held the power in that marriage, until the doors of the Supreme Court swung open 3 years later, and the country's most reclusive billionaire didn't walk toward the ex-husband. He walked straight to Sarah, and when he said her name, the entire room stopped breathing. The fluorescent lights of the Manhattan civil courtroom hummed with a sound that Sarah felt in her teeth. It was a low, electric buzz, like a fly trapped against a window pane. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the grain of the oak table. She was wearing a navy blue suit she'd bought at a thrift store in Queens 3 days ago. It was clean, pressed, and fit reasonably well, but next to the bespoke Italian wool suit her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, Richard was wearing, it looked like a costume. "Mrs. Harrington," Sarah looked up. The judge, an exhausted-looking man named William H. Gentry, was peering at her over his spectacles. "Miss Miller," Sarah corrected softly. "I'm reverting to my maiden name, Your Honor." From the other table, a scoff echoed. It was quiet, sharp, and unmistakably Richard. He didn't look at her. He was busy adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, whispering something to his lead attorney, a shark-like man named Thomas Banks, who charged $1,200 an hour to destroy lives. "Very well, Ms. Miller," Judge Gentry sighed, shuffling the mountain of paperwork. "The terms of the separation have been contested for 6 months. Mr. Harrington's counsel has argued effectively that the assets acquired during the marriage, specifically the Harrington Tech Holdings and the estate in the Hamptons, were purchased using funds from premarital trusts, rendering them non-marital property." Sarah felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She knew this was coming. Richard had been moving money for years, hiding it in shell companies and offshore accounts in the Caymans, places her court-appointed lawyer, a kind but overworked woman named Linda, couldn't reach. "Therefore," the judge continued, "the court awards Ms. Miller the contents of the joint checking account, totaling $4,300, and the deed to the property located at 4402 Blackwood Lane in Detroit, Michigan." Richard chuckled. It was audible this time. The Blackwood property was a joke between them, a dilapidated warehouse Richard had bought on a whim during a drunken bachelor party 10 years ago, thinking he'd turn it into a creative space. It had sat rotting ever since, racking up property taxes. He was dumping his debt on her. "Is that all, Your Honor?" Linda asked, her voice tight. "My client supported Mr. Harrington for 5 years while he built his company. She worked 2 jobs. She paid the rent on their first apartment. There is no paper trail proving those funds were an investment in the company," Judge Gentry said, looking sympathetic but bound by the law. "The law is about evidence, Counselor. Mr. Harrington has receipts. Miss Miller has memories." The gavel banged. It sounded like a gunshot. Sarah stood up. She didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of him. As she gathered her purse, Richard walked past her. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and arrogance. He paused, leaning in close to her ear. "You should have signed the NDA, Sarah," he whispered. "I would have given you 50 grand. Now, enjoy Detroit. I hear the rats are big this time of year." He walked out, flanked by his legal team. Waiting for him in the hallway was Jessica, 23 years old, blonde, and wearing a diamond ring that cost more than Sarah's parents had earned in their lifetimes. Richard slipped his arm around Jessica's waist, and they laughed, the sound echoing down the marble corridor. Sarah stood alone in the courtroom. Linda touched her arm. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. We can appeal, but it will cost money you don't have." "It's okay, Linda," Sarah said, her voice steady. "He thinks he took everything." "He did, honey." Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag. "No, he took the things that can be bought. He didn't take my mind." She walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding midday sun of New York City. She had 4,300, a crumbling warehouse in a different state, and a resume with a 10-year gap because Richard had insisted she stay home to manage the lifestyle. Everyone thought she was broken. They saw a woman past her prime, discarded for a newer model. But as Sarah hailed a cab to take her to the bus station, she couldn't afford a plane ticket. She wasn't thinking about the past. She was thinking about Blackwood Lane. Richard had forgotten one thing about that warehouse. He had bought it without looking at the basement. Sarah had gone there once, years ago, to clean it out. She had found something she had never told him about. It was time to go to work. 6 months later. The winter in Detroit was unforgiving. The wind screamed off the river, cutting through the thin walls of the small apartment Sarah rented 3 blocks from the warehouse. Her life was unrecognizable. The woman who used to host charity galas at the Met was now waking up at 4 a.m. to work the opening shift at a diner called Sal's. Her hands, once manicured, were chapped and red from scrubbing counters. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, the expensive highlights long grown out. But she wasn't unhappy. For the first time in 10 years, she was free. Every afternoon, when her shift ended at 2:00 p.m., she walked to the warehouse on Blackwood Lane. From the outside, it looked like a ruin. The brick was crumbling, the windows boarded up with plywood that had been spray-painted by local graffiti artists. Richard was right. On paper, this place was a liability. But inside, the lights were on. Sarah unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside. The main floor was empty, swept clean of debris. She had spent her first month just hauling out trash. But towards the back, she had set up a makeshift office, a folding table, a second-hand laptop, and a whiteboard covered in complex diagrams. She wasn't just sitting on the property. She was building. One Tuesday in November, her phone buzzed. It was her mother, calling from Florida. "Sarah, I saw the photos on Instagram." Her mother's voice was shaky. "Jessica posted pictures of their wedding in Como. Richard looks happy." Sarah put the phone on speaker as she typed a line of code into her laptop. "That's nice, Mom." "Nice?" "Sarah, he stole your life. And look at you. Your cousin Jenny said she saw you working at a diner. Is that true? Please tell me it's not true. It's embarrassing." Sarah stopped typing. She took a deep breath. "I am working at a diner, Mom. It pays the bills." "I told you not to sign those papers without fighting harder," her mother wept. "You're destitute. Everyone is talking about it. The Harringtons are American royalty now, and you're nobody." "I have to go, Mom. I have a meeting." "A meeting? With who? The dishwasher?" Sarah hung up. She didn't have the energy to explain. She looked at the whiteboard. In the center, circled in red, was a name. Project Ether. Richard had made his fortune in hardware. Servers, microchips, the physical backbone of tech. He thought software was fairy dust, something you hired kids in hoodies to handle. He never understood the architecture of data. But Sarah did. Before she was Mrs. Harrington, the trophy wife, she had been Sarah Miller, a scholarship student at MIT, with a double major in mathematics and cryptography. Richard had made her quit her PhD program when they got married because it intimidated the investors. So she had hidden her brain. But she hadn't turned it off. The warehouse wasn't just a building. It sat directly on top of a defunct fiber-optic trunk line that had been laid in the 90s and abandoned when a telecom giant went bust. Richard didn't know it was there. He hadn't done the survey. But Sarah had. She wasn't building a factory. She was building a private data haven. A knock echoed on the metal door. 3 sharp raps. Sarah checked the security camera she'd wired up. Standing outside was a man in a grey trench coat. He looked out of place in this neighbourhood, surrounded by chain-link fences and stray dogs. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and a posture that screamed military or old money. Sarah buzzed the door open. The man stepped in, looking around the cavernous, empty space with a critical eye. He spotted Sarah at her folding table and walked over. He didn't offer a hand. "You're hard to find, Miss Miller," he said. His voice was gravel. "I'm not hiding," Sarah replied, not standing up. "Who are you?" "My name is distinctive, so let's skip it for a moment. I represent a consortium of investors who value discretion." We heard a rumor. "Rumors are usually wrong," Sarah said. "Not this one. We heard there's a node in Detroit that's processing data at speeds that shouldn't be possible for a residential setup. Our technicians traced the ping here." The man looked at the laptop. "You're bypassing the regional throttling. You've tapped the dark fiber." Sarah smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile. "That sounds illegal. I'm just a waitress." The man laughed. "A waitress who writes kernel-level encryption drivers? I looked into you, Sarah. MIT, class of 2008, top of the class. Then you vanished into a marriage with Richard Harrington, a man who couldn't code "Hello World" if his life depended on it." He pulled a chair up and sat down. "My employer is looking for a place to store sensitive data. Off the grid, away from the cloud giants like Google and Amazon. We need a ghost server. You have the infrastructure, but you have no capital. You're eating ramen noodles and working for tips." He slid a check across the table. It was face down. "We want to buy the building," he said. Sarah didn't look at the check. "It's not for sale." "Everything is for sale, especially when you're broke." "I'm broke," Sarah said, leaning forward. "But I'm not stupid. If you trace the ping, you know my compression algorithm is what makes this line valuable. You don't want the building. You want the code." The man paused. He re-evaluated her. "Smart. Okay. What do you want?" "I want a partner," Sarah said. "Silent. I retain 51% control. You put up the capital to renovate this place and buy the server racks. I provide the security and the architecture." "And why would we trust you?" Sarah turned her laptop screen toward him. "Because 5 minutes ago, while you were talking, I breached your phone's firewall. You're carrying a burner, but you have a GPS tracker active, linked to a private server in Zurich. Your employer is Arthur Sterling." The man's face went pale. He reached for his pocket, checking his phone. Arthur Sterling, the billionaire, the man in the high castle of the tech world. He hadn't been seen in public in 5 years. "You hacked Sterling?" the man whispered. "I knocked on the door," Sarah corrected. "Now, do you want to do business, or should I tell the world where Arthur Sterling is hiding?" The man stared at her for a long time. Then he slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a different envelope. He tore up the first check. "Mr. Sterling anticipated you might be difficult," the man said. "He authorized me to make a different offer. I'm listening." "He doesn't just want the server space. He wants to meet you. But not here. And not now. He has a legal issue looming in New York next year. a massive antitrust suit involving Harrington Tech. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Richard? Richard Harrington is trying to acquire one of Mr. Sterling's subsidiaries. He's playing dirty. He's suing us for patent infringement. If he wins, he becomes the biggest tech mogul in the hemisphere. If he loses, he's bankrupt. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline she hadn't felt in years. Mr. Sterling needs a consultant, the man said. Someone who knows Harrington Tech from the inside. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Sarah looked around her cold, empty warehouse. She thought of Richard's whisper in the courtroom. Enjoy Detroit. Tell Mr. Sterling I'm in, Sarah said, but I have one condition. Name it. When the time comes to face Richard, I want to be the one who drops the hammer. The transformation of 4402 Blackwood Lane was invisible from the street. To the casual observer and the few private investigators Richard occasionally sent to check on his ex-wife, Sarah was still a struggling divorcee living in a rusted city. They saw her walking to the grocery store in oversized coats. They saw the flickering lights of the warehouse and assumed she was squatting or running some desperate, small-time crafting business. But inside, the warehouse was a fortress. Arthur Sterling's funding had been limitless, but Sarah had spent it with surgical precision. The basement was now a climate-controlled server farm, humming with the quiet power of a supercomputer. The ground floor was a minimalist command center. Sarah stood before a wall of monitors, watching the data streams of Harrington Tech. He's getting sloppy, she said aloud. Sitting on a leather couch behind her was the man in the grey trench coat, whose name she had learned was Silas. He was Sterling's right hand, his fixer. Arrogance breeds mistakes, Silas said, sipping an espresso Sarah had brewed. Richard just fired his chief security officer, replaced him with Jessica's brother. Sarah turned, an eyebrow raised. The tennis instructor? The very same. Richard claims he wants loyalty over competence. Sarah laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He's practically handing me the keys to the kingdom. For the past year, Sarah hadn't just been building her own tech. She had been ghosting through Richard's. She hadn't stolen money. That would be petty and criminal. Instead, she had been observing. She knew his trade secrets, his erratic stock maneuvers, and most importantly, she knew the source of his sudden innovation 3 years ago that had made him a billionaire. He hadn't invented the Harrington Drive. He had stolen the core code from a defunct startup he'd acquired for pennies, erased the names of the original engineers, and patented it as his own. But he had missed a line of code. Sterling is ready to meet you, Silas said, standing up. Tonight? Where? The airfield, private hangar. We're going to Zurich. Sarah looked at her reflection in the dark monitor. The woman staring back wasn't the broken wife anymore. Her hair was cut into a sharp, chic bob. She wore a tailored black turtleneck and trousers. She looked like a weapon. Let's go. The meeting with Arthur Sterling took place in a chalet high in the Swiss Alps, accessible only by helicopter. Sterling was not what Sarah expected. The media painted him as a Howard Hughes figure, mad, unkempt, paranoid. The man who greeted her by the fireplace was elegant, sharp-eyed, and surprisingly warm. He was in a wheelchair, the result of a skiing accident years prior, a detail the press had missed. Sarah Miller, Sterling said, extending a hand. The woman who hacked my firewall in under 5 minutes. It was 4 minutes, Mr. Sterling. Sarah shook his hand. Your encryption keys rotate every 6. I had to be fast. Sterling laughed, delighted. Please sit. We have much to discuss. Silas tells me you have the smoking gun. Sarah pulled out a tablet. Richard isn't just infringing on your patents, Arthur. He's building his entire new cloud AI platform on a foundation that doesn't exist. He's selling vaporware to the Department of Defense. If he signs that government contract next month, and the tech fails, it won't just be bankruptcy. It will be treason. Sterling's face hardened. He's gambling with national security? He's desperate, Sarah explained. He's leveraged everything to maintain his lifestyle and Jessica's spending. He needs the DoD contract to cover the holes in his balance sheet. He thinks he can fake the tech until he hires someone to build it for real. But he can't build it, Sterling realized, because the only person who understands the compression architecture he's trying to mimic is sitting right here, Sarah finished. I wrote the original kernel for the prototype he stole. I never told him. I did it as a hobby while he was watching football. Sterling leaned back, tenting his fingers. So, we don't just sue him for patent infringement. We expose him as a fraud. If we sue him now, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper, he'll settle. He'll pay you a few $100 million to go away, and he'll keep his reputation. That's not enough. What do you propose? We let him think he's winning, Sarah said. We let him walk into court thinking he's about to crush you. We let him testify under oath that the tech is his. And then you call your expert witness. Sterling smiled, and for a moment the room felt colder. You have a ruthless streak, Sarah. I like it. New York City, 2 months later. Richard Harrington stood on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking Central Park. He held a glass of 1942 Dom Perignon, but it tasted like vinegar. Richard, babe, you're not listening to me, Jessica whined from inside the living room. She was sprawling on the white velvet sofa, looking at fabric swatches. Do you like the ivory or the cream for the yacht interior? Whatever costs less, Richard snapped, then instantly regretted it. Jessica sat up, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me. Since when do we care about cost? You're Richard Harrington. You're the king of Silicon Alley. Richard rubbed his temples. I know, Jess. I'm sorry. It's just, this lawsuit with Sterling Industries is a headache. Sterling, Jessica scoffed. Isn't he that old cripple who lives in a cave? Just buy him out. It's not that simple, Richard muttered. It should have been simple. Usually, when Richard stole tech, he buried the opposition in legal fees until they suffocated. But Sterling had infinite resources. And oddly, Sterling's legal team had been quiet. Too quiet. They had filed a suit claiming that Harrington Tech's new Project Icarus infringed on Sterling's Project Ether. Richard knew it was baseless, mostly because Project Icarus didn't really exist yet. It was just a flashy interface and a lot of promises. But what worried him was the data loss. For the last few weeks, files had been vanishing from the Harrington servers. Not big files, just small, crucial connectives. Emails from 3 years ago, R&D notes. It was as if someone was scrubbing the history of the company. He walked back inside. I need to go to the office. On a Sunday? Jessica pouted. Yes, I need to talk to your brother. When Richard arrived at Harrington Tech HQ, the mood was tense. His new head of security, Kyle, Jessica's brother, was playing video games on his phone in the server room. Kyle, Richard barked. Kyle jumped, dropping his phone. Whoa, chill, Rich. What's up? Why are we losing data? The logs show unauthorized access. Nah, man, I checked it, Kyle said, chewing gum. It's just glitches. We updated the system last week. Probably just some bugs. Bugs don't delete specific emails between me and the patent office from 2019, Richard hissed. Someone is in the system. Impossible. Our firewall is military grade. Richard shoved him aside and sat at the terminal. He wasn't a coder, but he knew enough to check the access logs. He scrolled through lines of gibberish. Then he saw it. A signature. a digital watermark left intentionally like a calling card. It was a small, pixelated image of a blackwood tree. Richard froze. Blackwood. 402. Blackwood Lane. Sarah, he whispered. He stood up, his heart hammering. Get me a private investigator, the expensive one, the guy who used to work for the CIA. I want eyes on Detroit, tonight. You think your ex-wife is hacking us? Kyle laughed. Rich, she's a waitress. She barely knows how to use an iPhone. She went to MIT, you idiot, Richard screamed, losing his composure. She played dumb because I liked it. Go. Richard paced the office. If Sarah was behind this, what did she have? Did she have the proof that he had doctored the original patent applications? He grabbed his phone and dialed his lead attorney, Thomas Banks. Banks, Richard said, his voice trembling. The Sterling lawsuit. When is the court date? Next week, Banks replied smoothly. Don't worry, Richard. We're going to crush them. Sterling has no evidence of infringement because, strictly speaking, your product is unique. I want to settle, Richard said. What? Richard, we can't settle. It looks like admission of guilt. The DoD contract is pending. If you settle, the military walks. Richard slammed his hand on the desk. He was trapped. If he settled, he lost the government money and went broke. If he fought, he had to go to court and risk exposure. But surely Sarah couldn't be working with Sterling. That was insane. Sterling was a recluse. Sarah was a nobody. It was just a coincidence. The Blackwood tag was probably just a random hacker group using a generic name. Fine, Richard said, sweating. We go to court, but I want you to bury them. I want to counter-sue for defamation. I want to destroy Arthur Sterling. That's the spirit, Banks said. Richard hung up. He walked to the window. He looked down at the city that worshipped him. You can't hurt me, Sarah, he whispered to the glass. You're nothing. The day of the trial, the steps of the Southern District Court of New York were a zoo. Reporters from CNN, Fox, Bloomberg, and TechCrunch were jostling for position. This was the heavyweight fight of the century. Sterling Industries versus Harrington Technologies. Old money versus new tech. Richard arrived in a black Maybach. He stepped out, looking like $1 billion in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. Jessica was on his arm, wearing a white dress that looked more appropriate for a gala than a courtroom. They smiled for the cameras, projecting unshakable confidence. Mr. Harrington, is it true Sterling is suing you for $2 billion? A reporter shouted. Arthur Sterling is a confused old man, Richard said smoothly into the microphones. He's jealous that the future belongs to us. We'll clear this up by lunch. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The air conditioner struggled against the body heat of the spectators. Richard took his seat at the defense table. Thomas Banks was arranging his files, looking bored and confident. Where is he? Richard asked, scanning the plaintiff's table. It was empty. Sterling won't show, Banks said. He hasn't left his Swiss compound in years. He'll send a proxy. Just then, the side doors opened. The room went silent. Arthur Sterling rolled in. He was in his motorized wheelchair, dressed in a suit that cost more than Richard's car. He looked frail, but his eyes were blazing blue lasers. He was flanked by a team of 4 lawyers, all looking grim and serious. Richard felt a bead of sweat roll down his back. Sterling never showed up. This was personal. Judge Gentry, the same judge who had presided over Sarah's divorce, now promoted to the federal circuit, banged the gavel. Order. We are here for opening statements in Case 4022. The morning went exactly as Richard hoped. Banks was brilliant. He painted Sterling as a patent troll, a dinosaur trying to tax the innovators. He argued that Harrington's Project Icarus was a revolutionary leap forward, completely unrelated to Sterling's old tech. Then it was the plaintiff's turn. Sterling's lead attorney stood up. He was a man named Elias Burke, known as the Undertaker in legal circles. "Your Honor," Burke said softly, "Mr. Harrington claims he built his technology from scratch. He claims he is the sole architect of the code that runs the modern world. We intend to prove that not only did he steal the foundation of his work, but he does not even understand how it functions." Richard scoffed audibly. "To do this," Burke continued, "we would like to call our first witness, a technical expert who has performed a forensic audit of the Harrington servers." Richard leaned over to Banks. "Who did they hire? Some nerd from Google?" Banks shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We'll discredit them." "The plaintiff calls." Burke paused. He turned toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The entire room turned to look. "Ms. Sarah Miller." Richard froze. His pen dropped from his hand, clattering loudly on the floor. The doors swung open. Sarah walked in. She was not the woman who had left this building 3 years ago. She was wearing a cream-colored power suit that highlighted her sharp features. Her head was high, her stride purposeful. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the judge. She looked straight at Richard. And for the first time in his life, Richard Harrington felt true, primal fear. A murmur ripped through the courtroom. The reporters were whispering frantically. "Is that the ex-wife? The broke one? What is she doing here?" Sarah walked to the witness stand and placed her hand on the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Sarah said. Her voice was clear, bell-like, and cold. "Ms. Miller," Burke began, walking toward her, "please state your current occupation for the court." Sarah adjusted the microphone. "I am the chief technical architect for Sterling Industries and the primary shareholder of Blackwood Data Solutions." Richard's mouth fell open. "Primary shareholder? And prior to this?" Burke asked. "Prior to this, I was unpaid research and development for Harrington Technologies," Sarah said, her eyes locking onto Richard's. "Although at the time, my title was wife." "Objection!" Banks jumped up. "Relevance?" "The witness is establishing her expertise regarding the defendant's technology," Judge Gentry said, peering over his glasses. He recognized her. His eyes widened slightly. "Overruled. You may continue." "Ms. Miller," Burke said, handing her a document. "Do you recognize this code?" "I do," Sarah said. "It's the source code for the Harrington drive." "And who wrote it?" Sarah smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "I did," she said. "In 2018, on a laptop my husband told me was too complicated for me to use. And I can prove it, because I left a signature inside the kernel that he never found." "What is that signature?" "If you run the compile sequence in reverse," Sarah said, addressing the judge, "it doesn't output numbers. It outputs a text string." "And what does the text string say?" Burke asked. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. Sarah leaned into the mic. "It says, 'Nice try, Richard.'" The moment Sarah Miller took her seat in the witness stand, the atmosphere in the Southern District Court of New York shifted from a legal proceeding to a gladiatorial arena. The air conditioning hummed, struggling against the stifling heat generated by the packed gallery. But for Richard Harrington, the room felt like a freezer. He stared at his ex-wife. He hadn't seen her this close in 3 years. He remembered her as soft-spoken, accommodating, wearing oversized sweaters and worrying about his cholesterol. The woman sitting 10 feet away was made of steel. She adjusted the microphone with a steady hand, her eyes scanning the room, not with fear, but with the cold precision of an engineer inspecting a faulty circuit. Thomas Banks, Richard's lead attorney, stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a shark preparing to smell blood. He had destroyed CEOs, senators, and celebrities in this very room. He assumed Sarah would be easy prey, a bitter ex-wife with a grudge and no resume. "Ms. Miller," Banks began, his voice dripping with faux politeness, "let's be clear about why we are here. You claim to be the chief technical architect for Sterling Industries. A fancy title. But isn't it true that for the last 2 years, your primary employment was waiting tables at a diner in Detroit called Sal's?" A ripple of snickers moved through the press section. Richard allowed himself a small, smug smile. Good, he thought. Humiliate her. Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone. "That is correct. I served coffee and eggs. It's honest work, Mr. Banks, unlike stealing intellectual property." "Objection!" Banks roared. "Argumentative!" "Sustained," Judge Gentry said, though his eyes lingered on Sarah with curiosity. "Just answer the questions, Ms. Miller." Banks paced in front of the jury box, playing to the crowd. "You have no formal employment record in the tech sector for the last decade. You dropped out of MIT. You spent 10 years as a homemaker. And now we are expected to believe that you, not the hundreds of engineers at Harrington Tech, wrote the code that runs the world's most advanced cloud network?" He stopped and leaned on the railing of the witness stand, looming over her. "Isn't it true, Miss Miller, that you are simply a scorned woman acting as a puppet for Mr. Sterling to hurt the man who moved on without her?" The courtroom went deadly silent. Jessica, sitting in the front row, smirked openly. Sarah looked at Banks. Then she looked past him, locking eyes with Richard. "I didn't drop out of MIT, Mr. Banks. I went all but dissertation because my husband asked me to help him launch his first startup. I wrote the back end for his first 3 products while he was at happy hour with investors. I stayed home not because I couldn't work, but because Richard was terrified that if I walked into a boardroom, people would realize who the real genius was." "Objection! Hearsay!" Banks shouted, his face reddening. "You asked for my history," Sarah said calmly. "I'm giving it to you, and regarding the code, I didn't just write it, I signed it." Banks laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You signed it? We've audited the code, Ms. Miller. There is no signature. There are no comments. It is clean." "You looked at the surface," Sarah said. "You didn't look at the mathematics." She turned to Judge Gentry. "Your Honor, I am requesting that the defendant's personal laptop, the one currently sitting on his desk, which acts as the master key for the Harrington mainframe, be connected to the court display." Richard lunged forward, grabbing his laptop with both hands. "Absolutely not. This machine contains sensitive trade secrets. I have pending contracts with the Department of Defense. You cannot grant access to a competitor." "Mr. Harrington," Judge Gentry said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is a federal courtroom, not your boardroom. If that laptop contains the evidence regarding the authorship of the code, it is material to this case." "It's a trick," Richard screamed, sweat beading on his forehead. "She's going to upload a virus. She's a hacker. If she touches the keyboard, you may object," Judge Gentry ruled. "Bailiff, secure the device and connect it to the main display. The witness will instruct the court technician verbally. She will not touch the device." Richard held onto the laptop for a second too long. The bailiff, a burly man who had seen far worse than the tantrums of a tech billionaire, gently but firmly pried it from his fingers. Richard sank back into his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Jessica for support, but she was chewing her lip, her eyes darting between him and the screen. The massive monitor on the courtroom wall flickered to life. It showed the desktop of Richard's computer, a wallpaper of him shaking hands with the president. "Open the command terminal," Sarah instructed the court technician. The technician, a young man named Dave, who looked terrified to be in the middle of this, typed the command. A black window appeared. "Navigate to the system kernel," Sarah said, reciting the file path from memory. "Directory, SSIS, core, drivers H drive, beta." Banks stood up. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. She is reading file paths that are public knowledge." "Scroll to line 45 thou 22, Sarah continued, ignoring him. The technician held down the down arrow key. The code flew by, a matrix of white text on black. Functions, variables, syntax that only the experts in the room understood. Finally, it stopped. "There," Sarah pointed. On the screen was a block of hexadecimal data. To the layman, it looked like gibberish, just rows of numbers and letters. 02A 4C 999 8B. "This is your smoking gun?" Banks scoffed. "It's a memory dump. It's junk data." "It looks like junk data to a thief," Sarah said coldly. "But it's a polymorphic cipher. Richard, do you remember the first time we met? In the library at MIT? Richard didn't answer. He was pale, breathing shallowly. "I was studying cryptography," Sarah said to the jury. "I wrote a thesis on hiding data within executable memory blocks. Richard never read my thesis. He used it as a coaster for his beer." She turned back to the technician. "The cipher requires a key to unlock. Without the key, it remains random noise. If you enter the wrong key, it deletes itself." The tension in the room was palpable. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. "Enter the key," Sarah said. "It's the date Richard told me he filed for divorce, the day he said he didn't love me anymore. 04/12/2019. The technician hesitated, then typed the numbers. "Enter, key, 0441020099. He hit enter. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Richard let out a breath, a desperate hope rising in his chest. "She's bluffing. It's not working." Then, the screen rippled. The block of random numbers began to dissolve. The characters swirled, rearranging themselves like a digital kaleidoscope. The white text turned a vibrant, piercing green. The noise faded away, and in its place, structure appeared. It wasn't code anymore. It was English, the letters locked into place, forming a message that had been buried in the heart of Harrington Tech's billion-dollar empire for years, waiting for this exact moment. Large author authentication verified. Creator, Sarah Miller. Timestamp, August 14th, 2018. Message follows. "If you are reading this, Richard, it means you finally stole the wrong file. You can take the house, you can take the money, but you can never take my mind. Nice try." The silence that followed was louder than an explosion. It was absolute, total. The words, "nice try," glowed on the massive screen, looming over Richard like a neon tombstone. "Oh my God," a reporter in the front row whispered. Then, chaos erupted. Flashbulbs exploded like strobe lights. Every journalist in the room was on their feet, shouting questions. The sketch artist was furiously drawing Richard's face, which had gone slack with shock. Thomas Banks slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. He dropped his pen. It rolled across the table and fell to the floor, the sound lost in the roar of the crowd. He knew, in that instant, that his career was effectively over. He had allowed his client to walk into a massacre. Judge Gentry was banging the gavel, but he lacked his usual force. He was staring at the screen, a look of stunned admiration on his face. "Mr. Harrington," the judge said, his voice amplified by the microphone, cutting through the din. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Richard tried to stand. His legs wouldn't work. He looked at the screen, at the message from the wife he had discarded, the woman he had called useless and boring. It's a bug," Richard croaked, his voice cracking. "It's a glitch." "It is not a glitch." Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "It is the source. Everything you built, everything you sold, every stock option you cashed. It's all fruit from a poisonous tree. You didn't build Harrington Tech, Richard. I did. She stood up from the witness stand, smoothing her skirt. She looked 10 feet tall. And now, she said, looking him dead in the eye as the flashbulbs blinded him, I'm taking it back. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to crack the very foundation of Richard Harrington's life. In the matter of Sterling Industries versus Harrington Technologies, Judge Gentry announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. The jury finds the defendant liable on all counts: willful patent infringement, theft of trade secrets, corporate fraud. Richard sat frozen. The blood roared in his ears, drowning out the gasps from the gallery. He stared straight ahead at the empty space on the wall where the screen had just displayed his humiliation. The court awards the plaintiff damages in the amount of $1.4 billion, the judge continued, looking down at Richard with thinly veiled disgust. Furthermore, an immediate injunction is placed on all Harrington assets, pending a federal audit by the SEC. This court is adjourned. $1.4 billion. It was a death sentence. It wasn't just bankruptcy, it was annihilation. Richard turned to his left, instinctively reaching for Jessica's hand. He needed someone to tell him it was a nightmare. He needed her to tell him they would fly to the Cayman Islands and start over. "Jess," he whispered, but the chair beside him was empty. He looked around wildly. He caught a glimpse of white fabric disappearing through the side exit doors. She hadn't even waited for the jury to be polled. She saw the ship sinking, and she had bolted for the lifeboats before the captain even knew they were hit. Richard walked out of the courthouse, alone. The steps, usually a place where he held court with the press, were now a gauntlet of shame. The reporters didn't shout questions anymore. They just took photos. Flash after flash, capturing the face of a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings made of stolen code. Someone in the back of the crowd, a former employee perhaps, or just a citizen tired of tech arrogance, shouted out, "Nice try, Richard." The crowd laughed. The phrase was already trending on Twitter. By the time Richard got into his car, "Nice try, Richard" was a meme. It was on T-shirts. It was the punchline of late-night monologues. He wasn't just broke. He was a joke. The collapse of the Harrington empire was brutal and swift. In the world of high finance, sharks smell blood instantly. Within 48 hours, the banks froze his accounts. The creditors descended like locusts. The penthouse overlooking Central Park was seized first. Richard watched from the street as movers hauled out his life. The velvet sofas, the imported art, the grand piano he didn't know how to play. It was all auctioned off to pay for the legal fees of a defense that had failed. The yacht, the Lady Jessica, was impounded in Monaco. But the hardest blow came 2 weeks later. Richard was staying in a budget motel in New Jersey, the only place that would take his cash-only payment. He was watching the news on a small, grainy television. The news anchor was standing in front of the Harrington Tech headquarters in Manhattan. Workers were up on cranes, removing the massive chrome H from the building's facade. "It's the end of an era," the reporter said. "Harrington Tech has officially filed for Chapter 7 liquidation, but the story has a twist. The intellectual property, the code that started it all, has been acquired by a new firm based in Detroit." The screen cut to a clip of Sarah. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't gloating. She was standing at a podium, looking calm, professional, and radiantly intelligent. "We aren't interested in the brand," Sarah said to the press. "We are interested in the technology. We are taking the code back to where it was born. We're taking it home." Richard turned off the TV. He sat in the dark, the neon sign of the motel blinking outside his window. Buzz. Click. Buzz. Click. He had told her she was nothing without him. He had told her to enjoy the rats. Now, he was the one in the dark. 1 year later, Detroit, Michigan. The transformation of 4402 Blackwood Lane was complete. It was no longer a symbol of urban decay. It was a beacon of the city's resurgence. The exterior of the warehouse had been preserved. Sarah insisted on keeping the old brick as a reminder of where they started. But the interior was a masterpiece of modern design. Glass walkways connected open concept server rooms. The air smelled of expensive coffee and ozone. The sign on the front door was modest, etched in brushed steel. Miller and Sterling Data Solutions. Sarah sat in her office on the top floor, reviewing the quarterly projections. The company was thriving. They had secured the Department of Defense contract that Richard had lost. They were building the secure cloud infrastructure for half of the Fortune 500. But Sarah didn't run the company like Richard had. There were no golden parachutes, no private jets, no vanity projects. She paid her interns. She offered full benefits. She built a daycare center on the first floor for single mothers. She led with the empathy she had gained during those long, hard months working at the diner. There was a knock on her glass door. "Come in," Sarah called out, not looking up from her tablet. Arthur Sterling rolled in. The reclusive billionaire had come out of hiding to serve as the chairman of the board. But mostly, he just enjoyed watching Sarah work. He saw in her the daughter he never had. "The numbers for the European expansion look aggressive," Sterling said, smiling. "I like it." "We need to capture the market before the clones pop up," Sarah replied, taking a sip of tea. "How is the legal team? Any loose ends?" "Just one," Sterling said. He hesitated, his expression turning amused. "We received a letter today. It was forwarded from the corrections facility in upstate New York." Sarah paused. She set her cup down. Richard had been sentenced to 36 months in federal prison for securities fraud. It was a light sentence, all things considered, but for a man who used to wear $5,000 suits, prison was hell. "What does he want?" Sarah asked, her voice level. "He's applying for a job," Sterling said. He slid a piece of handwritten lined paper across the desk. Sarah picked it up. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. "Dear Sarah, I know I have no right to ask, but I will be released on parole in 3 months. I have nowhere to go. No one will hire me. The industry has blacklisted me. I'm writing to ask if there is any position available at Miller and Sterling. I can consult. I can help with sales. I know the old client list. Please, I'm begging you, I have changed." Sincerely, Richard Sarah read the letter twice. She remembered the way he had looked at her in the courtroom, not with remorse, but with terror. She remembered the years he made her feel small so he could feel big. She looked out the window. Snow was falling on Detroit, blanketing the city in white. It was beautiful. "He says he has changed," Sterling noted. "Do you believe him?" "I think he's desperate," Sarah said. "And I think he's realized that he never actually knew how to do the work. He was just the face." "So? What should I tell him? Should I throw it in the trash?" Sarah looked at the bustling office below her. She saw young engineers laughing, collaborating, building the future. She thought about the karmic balance of the universe. "No," Sarah said slowly. "Don't throw it away. Everyone deserves a chance to work." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "You're going to hire him? As a consultant?" Sarah laughed. It was a genuine, bright sound that filled the room. "Absolutely not, Arthur. He doesn't know the first thing about our code. He never did." She handed the letter back to Sterling, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "Write him back. Tell him we have an opening in the maintenance department. The night shift." Sterling chuckled. "Janitorial?" The floors in the server room need to be kept spotless, Sarah said, picking up her stylus to get back to work. Tell him he can have the job, but tell him the uniform comes out of his paycheck. And if he refuses? He won't, Sarah said, turning her attention back to the screen where streams of green code, her code, flowed like a river. He needs the money. She tapped the screen, executing a new command. Besides, she added softly, I think he'll find the basement very familiar. It's where I did my best work. Sarah Miller didn't look back. The past was a lesson, not a prison. And as the snow fell outside, covering the scars of the city, she knew one thing for sure. The view was much better from the top. And that is how you serve revenge, ice cold and with a mop in hand. Sarah went from a waitress with 4,000 to the CEO of an empire, proving that true power isn't about the money you steal, it's about the value you create. Richard ended up exactly where he tried to put her, scrubbing floors in the dark. I honestly got chills when the code said, "Nice try, Richard." If you enjoyed this roller coaster of a story, please destroy that like button. It helps the algorithm so much. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. I have an even crazier story coming next week about a cheating husband who didn't know his wife owned the company he worked for. You do not want to miss it. Let me know in the comments. Was Sarah too nice, offering him the janitor job? Or was it the perfect punishment? I'll be reading your replies. Thanks for watching, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.